If you have ever discovered that the person you trusted most had been living an entirely different life behind your back, and somehow found the strength to stand back up. This story is going to stay with you. Like this video right now and subscribe to this channel, because what happened on the Family Feud stage between one woman, her husband, and Steve Harvey is something television has almost never seen. Let's get into it. Begin us. There are betrayals that leave a mark you can hide, and there are betrayals that reorganize you entirely, the kind that forces you to look back at every memory you have of a person and ask which parts of this were real. That is not just heartbreak. That is the loss of a history you thought you shared. It is finding out that the story you believed you were living was, at least in part, a story someone else had written without telling you. On a Friday afternoon in a television studio in Atlanta, a woman named Renee Fontaine walked onto the Family Feud stage. She was 53 years old. She was dressed impeccably. A structured blazer, her grandmother's pearl earrings, the kind of quiet elegance that does not announce itself. She had her 2 adult children beside her, and she had her sister, and she had the particular composure of a woman who has spent considerable time deciding how she wants to carry herself through something that could very easily break her. Standing at the other end of the family line was her husband of 27 years, Gerald Fontaine. He was well-dressed, broadly smiling, and operating under what would very shortly prove to be a catastrophic misunderstanding. The misunderstanding that Renee had agreed to come on this show so the family could win some prize money and have a good time. She had not. What Steve Harvey was about to walk into, without any preparation, would test every instinct he had developed across decades of television, and what he chose to do when the truth surfaced, live, in front of a studio audience, with cameras rolling, would become one of the most referenced moments in the show's history. Renee Fontaine was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the daughter of a high school principal and a registered nurse. Her parents were people of deep faith and deeper practicality. They believed that character was demonstrated through behavior over time, not declared through words, and they raised their children accordingly. Renee grew up understanding that a person's reliability was their most important attribute. That you showed up when you said you would. That you told the truth even when the alternative was more comfortable. That the people in your life deserved your consistency above everything else. She studied nursing at Louisiana State University, following her mother's path, and built a career as a pediatric nurse that spanned 3 decades across 2 hospitals. She was the kind of nurse that families asked for by name, the kind whose presence in a difficult situation reduced the temperature in a room. She had spent her professional life being reliable for strangers in their most frightened moments. It was, in every sense, who she was. She met Gerald Fontaine at a church social when she was 25. He was charming and attentive and, by every visible measure, a man of similar values. He worked in commercial real estate, was close with his family, attended church reliably, and had the kind of easy social warmth that made him genuinely liked in every room he entered. They married within 2 years of meeting. Their son Marcus came first, then their daughter Simone. The family settled in a comfortable house in the suburbs of Baton Rouge, and built the kind of life that looks, from any angle, like exactly what it is supposed to be. For 22 of their 27 years together it was. Whatever private difficulties existed, and in every long marriage there are difficulties, the foundation appeared sound. Gerald was a present father. Renee was an attentive wife. They had built something together and both of them appeared to take that seriously. The discovery, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but in the understated way that genuinely catastrophic things often do. A piece of mail that was not addressed to Gerald Fontaine, or at least not to this Gerald Fontaine. A return address from a county courthouse in a city that Gerald had claimed to have visited for work. A document that, once Renee had read it carefully and then read it again, was unmistakably a legal record of a marriage. Gerald Fontaine had a second wife. In Birmingham, Alabama, she was 41 years old, her name was Donna, and by the date on the document Renee was holding, she and Gerald had been legally married for 6 years. 6 years. A period of time that spanned a family holiday to the Bahamas, two of Renee's parents' anniversaries, their own 25th wedding anniversary dinner at the restaurant where they had their first date, and approximately 300 ordinary Tuesdays on which Gerald had come home, kissed his wife, asked about her day, and said nothing. Renee did not collapse. That was what she told her sister Paulette later. She had expected, if this moment ever came, to fall apart immediately. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table for a very long time, reading the document several more times, and then made herself a cup of tea. She was a pediatric nurse. She had sat with families in the worst moments of their lives and held herself steady because they needed her too. She drew on the same training now. She held herself steady because she needed herself to. The confrontation with Gerald came 2 days later, after she had spoken with a lawyer. Gerald denied it first, then minimized it, then tried a version of events so implausible that it communicated, more clearly than anything else could have, that he had no intention of telling her the truth voluntarily. The marriage was, in every real sense, over from that moment. The Family Feud appearance was Paulette's idea. Renee had been in the process of separating from Gerald and had made clear to her children that the legal situation would be resolved, that she was going to be fine, and that she intended to conduct herself through all of it with the same dignity she had brought to everything else in her life. Paulette, who had watched her sister carry the weight of this discovery for 4 months, said one evening, "I think you need a day where something goes your way in front of people. I think you need witnesses." She had already submitted the application. Renee, after a long silence, had agreed on one condition: Gerald would be part of the 5-person team. She wanted him there. She had her reasons. The morning of the taping, Gerald was in a good mood. He had convinced himself, over the preceding weeks, that Renee's decision to include him in the Family Feud appearance was a sign that things were salvageable between them. He was, as Paulette later described it, operating on an entirely different version of reality than the one everyone else in the family was living in. He dressed carefully, made coffee for the household, and rode to the studio with the air of a man who believed the afternoon would go well for him. Marcus, who was 26, had barely spoken to his father since learning the truth 3 months earlier. Simone, 24, had said more, most of it direct and none of it gentle. They had both, at their mother's request, agreed to hold the peace for the duration of the taping. Renee had been very specific about this. She wanted the day to unfold on its own terms. She did not want a family confrontation engineered for cameras. She wanted something more measured and, in its way, more permanent. The Fontaine family was facing the Washington family from Charlotte, a warm, boisterous group with 3 generations present and the easy chemistry of people who have chosen to genuinely like each other. The contrast with the Fontaines, whose internal architecture was under considerable strain, was noticeable backstage, if not immediately obvious to anyone who did not know what to look for. Steve Harvey came out and the room lifted immediately. He worked through both families with his characteristic warmth, finding the laugh and the humanizing detail in each person he reached. The Washington family gave him immediate material. There was a 91-year-old great-grandmother in the front row who had never missed an episode and was dressed for the occasion in what she described as her competition outfit. The audience loved her completely. When Steve reached the Fontaine family, he started with Gerald. Gerald was smooth and comfortable. Real estate had given him a lifetime of practice at being immediately likable, and the brief exchange was easy and warm. Steve smiled, moved on. He reached Renee. He asked her name, her occupation, how long she had been a nurse. Renee answered each question with the precise, unhurried calm that had characterized her professionally for 30 years. Steve looked at her for a moment in the way that he looks at people when his instincts are telling him something his conscious mind has not yet fully formulated. "How long have you and Gerald been married?" he asked. 27 years, Renee said. 27 years, Steve repeated, nodding appreciatively. That is a long time. What is the secret? The studio waited for the warm, familiar answer that question always produces. Renee looked at Steve with complete steadiness and said, "I am still trying to figure that out. It turns out I did not know as much about my marriage as I thought I did." The room shifted. Not dramatically, There was no gasp, no eruption, just a subtle collective recalibration, the kind that happens when something has been said that does not fit the expected shape of a sentence. Steve Harvey did not move on. He held the moment carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has been handed to you unexpectedly. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. Renee looked at him. Then she looked at Gerald, who had gone very still. Then she looked back at Steve. "My husband," she said, with the measured clarity of a woman who has rehearsed nothing and prepared everything, has been legally married to another woman in Birmingham, Alabama for the past 6 years. I found out 4 months ago. I wanted to come here today because I wanted one afternoon where I was somewhere public and something went right. That is the only secret I have. I cannot speak for his." The studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the lighting equipment was audible. Then it erupted. The audience reaction was immediate and overwhelming, not the theatrical excitement of a game show crowd responding to a prize reveal, but something rawer and more human. People were on their feet. Some of them were crying. Several were audibly speaking directly to Renee across the studio floor. The Washington family, standing 20 feet away, had collectively frozen. The 91-year-old great-grandmother, Dorothea Washington, was shaking her head slowly with an expression of such concentrated disapproval that it required no verbal accompaniment. Gerald Fontaine stood with his hands at his sides and his face in the careful arrangement of a man who has just been handed something he cannot put down and cannot hold. Steve Harvey stood at the center of all of it and did not move for a long moment. Then he did something that production staff would later say they had never seen him do in all his years of hosting. He turned to the cameras, made a small hand gesture to the production team that meant hold, and turned back to Renee and Gerald. The game had not started. It was not going to start yet. There was something that needed to happen first. "Steve takes control." "Gerald," Steve said. His voice had the quality it gets when he is not performing and not entertaining. When he is simply one man addressing another with the full weight of what he has just heard. "I need you to look at your wife right now." Gerald looked at Renee. Renee looked back at him without expression. "Is what she just said true?" Steve asked. A long pause. Gerald's jaw worked. "It is complicated," he said. "No," Steve said immediately without raising his voice. "It is not complicated. A thing is either true or it is not true. Is what your wife just said true?" Another pause. Then, barely audible, "Wes." The studio responded. Steve held up one hand for quiet, and the room obeyed immediately. "I have been doing this show for a long time," Steve said, still speaking to Gerald, still without theatrics. "I have talked to thousands of families on this stage. Thousands. I have seen a lot. I want to say something to you, man to man, that I mean completely. What you did to this woman, 27 years, 2 children, a life built together, and you put a second marriage inside that life without telling her. That is not complicated. That is a choice you made, over and over, every single day for 6 years, to look at your wife and say nothing. I need you to understand the weight of that, not for me. Not for this audience, for her. For her specifically." Gerald said nothing. "Look at her," Steve said quietly. Gerald looked at Renee, and what happened next was the moment that audiences would return to in the years of discussion and coverage that followed. Because Gerald Fontaine, charming, smooth, real estate, comfortable Gerald Fontaine, who had managed his way through every difficult conversation of his adult life, began to cry, not theatrical tears deployed strategically, the other kind, the kind that arrives when a person is finally in a room they cannot navigate out of, looking at someone they have genuinely wronged, and the full weight of what they have done arrives all at once. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was broken and entirely without composure. "Renee, I am sorry. You did not deserve any of this. I am sorry." Renee looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not soften and it did not harden. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are seeing clearly for the first time after looking at it for a very long time. Then she nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement. The nod of a woman who has heard what she came to hear and is now ready to move forward. She turned to Steve Harvey. "Can we play the game now?" she said. The studio came apart completely. Even Steve Harvey laughed, the honest, released laugh of a man who has just witnessed something that defies every preparation he has ever made for his job. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we can absolutely play the game." The main game was played in an atmosphere unlike anything the show's production team could recall. The Fontaines won it, carried almost entirely by Renee, Marcus, and Simone, who played with a ferocious, unified precision that had a clear emotional source. Gerald played too, quietly and without his earlier ease, as a man who understood that he was present on sufferance and was trying to contribute something to a family he had damaged. The Washington family competed hard and well but were, by this point, playing against a tide they could not reverse. For fast money, Marcus went first. He was tight and methodical and scored 139 points. He was his mother's son in the way he played, practical and unhurried. That left Renee needing 61 points. When she stepped to the fast money podium, the studio was quiet with something that was not quite silence. The charged, attentive quality of an audience that has been through something real with a person and is now watching the conclusion. Steve walked up beside her. He did not open with the standard setup. He simply looked at her and said, "How are you?" "Lighter," Renee said. Steve nodded. "Then let's go. Name something people do when they decide to start over." Renee answered without a pause, "Pack their bags." The board flipped. Number 1 answer, 38 points. The audience cheered. "Name a word that describes someone who keeps a secret for too long." "A breath." "Coward." The studio responded immediately. The board revealed it as the number 2 answer, 26 points. They were already past the threshold. But nobody moved. "Name something a strong person does after being betrayed." Renee's answer arrived with the complete stillness of someone who has been living inside the answer for 4 months. "Rebuilds." Number 1 answer, 44 points. The audience was standing before Steve read it out. "Name something a woman needs more than an apology." Without hesitation, her piece back. The board turned. Number 2 answer, 21 points. The room was responding to every answer now, not just as a game result but as a statement, each one landing with the weight of lived experience rather than survey data. Last question. Name something that gets stronger after it breaks. Renee Fontaine looked at the board. She looked out at the audience. She placed both hands flat on the podium, and in the expression that crossed her face in that moment, not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and more permanent, the expression of a woman arriving at the far side of something she was not sure she would cross. The entire audience understood exactly what the answer was going to be before she said it. "A woman," she said. The board turned. Number 1 answer, 39 points. What followed was not a game show celebration. It was something more like a communal exhale, the release of something the room had been holding since the moment Renee had said what she said in the pre-game introductions. People were crying. Paulette was holding Simone. Marcus had both arms around his mother and his face pressed into her shoulder. Even members of the Washington family, strangers, competitors, people with no stake in this story beyond the fact that they had witnessed it, were visibly moved. Steve Harvey stood at the edge of the stage for a moment, looking at all of it. Then he walked to the center of the room, turned to the cameras, and spoke. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly because I think it needs to be said on this stage right now. What Renee Fontaine just did, not just the fast money round, not just the answers, but the whole of this afternoon, took a kind of courage that most people will never be called on to demonstrate. She came here carrying something that would have been entirely understandable to carry privately, in pieces, for years. Instead, she walked onto a stage, in front of hundreds of people, and she told the truth. She did it without drama. She did it without revenge. She did it with the same dignity she has clearly brought to every part of her life." He paused. "And then she played the game. She played it beautifully, because that is who this woman is. That is the kind of person she built herself into over 53 years, and no decision that somebody else made, no matter how devastating, gets to take that from her. Nobody else's choices define you. Only yours do." He turned to Gerald, who was standing at the side of the stage, pale and very still. "Gerald, you said sorry earlier, and I believe you meant it. But sorry is a starting point, not a destination. What you owe this woman, and your children, is not a moment of apology. It is a sustained accounting, over time, through your behavior. That is the only kind of sorry that means anything. I hope you understand that." Gerald nodded. He did not speak. It was, under the circumstances, exactly the right choice. The episode aired 6 weeks after taping. The clip of Renee's pre-game revelation, Steve's confrontation with Gerald, and the fast money round circulated on every major platform within hours of broadcast. By the end of the first day, it had been viewed 9 million times. By the end of the week, 22 million. The coverage was extensive and consistent in what it focused on, not the sensational dimension of the bigamy, which was what most viewers expected to lead the coverage, but Renee herself, her composure, her clarity, the particular quality of her answers in the fast money round, which people watched and re-watched because each one felt like it had been drawn from something deeper than survey data. "A woman" was, within 48 hours, one of the most quoted phrases on social media. Printed on things, stitched onto things, shared in direct messages between women who wanted their friends to see it. A professor of sociology at Emory University wrote a brief essay about the moment for a popular academic newsletter, arguing that what people were responding to was not the drama but the dignity, the specific and increasingly rare sight of a person choosing to conduct themselves with grace in circumstances that would have justified anything but grace. Renee did not seek the attention. She made no public appearances beyond a single brief interview she gave to a local Baton Rouge news outlet, in which she said 3 things clearly and declined to elaborate on any of them. The legal situation was being handled. Her children were well. She was going to be fine. The reporter pushed for more, and Renee, with the measured patience of a woman who has spent 30 years being the calmest person in the room, said, "I came on that show to have one afternoon where something went right in public. I had that. I am grateful. Everything after it is private." The months that followed Renee's divorce from Gerald was finalized 8 months after the taping. The legal complexity of the bigamy situation added several layers to the process, but Renee had, characteristically, prepared thoroughly. The settlement gave her the family home, which she chose to sell. She bought a smaller house closer to the hospital where she worked, closer to her mother, and entirely her own. Marcus and Simone navigated their relationships with their father separately and at their own pace. Renee was consistent on this point. She did not tell her children what to feel or what to do. She told them that their father's choices were his accounting to manage, not theirs, and that their primary obligation was to their own integrity and their own healing. Simone found this easier than Marcus, who carried the particular anger of a son who had modeled himself on a man who had turned out to be different from who he appeared. It took time. Most of the important things do. Paulette, whose idea the whole thing had been, said in a conversation with Renee 6 months after the episode aired, "I thought that day would give you closure. I didn't think it would make you famous." Renee had laughed, the full, unguarded laugh of a woman who has reclaimed her lightness. "I am not famous," she said. "I am just someone who told the truth on television. The truth was always there. I just said it out loud." What Steve Harvey said, that stayed in the months following the episode, Steve Harvey addressed it in several contexts with the seriousness it deserved. He was careful and precise in what he said, distinguishing consistently between the specifics of Gerald's actions and the broader principle he had tried to articulate on stage. "The most important thing I said that day, the thing I most want people to take from it, is not about what Gerald did. What Gerald did was wrong and it had consequences, and those consequences are his to manage. The important thing is what I said about Renee, about the fact that nobody else's choices define you. Only yours do." He returned to this principle repeatedly, in different framings, because he felt it was the part most at risk of being lost in the more dramatic surface narrative. When something terrible is done to you by someone you trusted, there is a version of events in which that becomes your story, in which you are permanently the person that happened to. Some people live there for years, and I understand why. The injury is real, the damage is real, the grief is real. But Renee showed us, on that stage, that there is another version available. The version in which you are still the author of your own life. You choose how you carry it. You choose what it makes you. The person who hurt you does not get that decision. You keep it. The lesson this story carries. Renee Fontaine's story is unusual in its specifics, but the emotional architecture of her experience is widely shared. The discovery that a person you built a life with was not the person you believed them to be. The period of private carrying, before the truth is spoken publicly. The moment of reckoning when the account is finally given. The question of who you are and who you choose to be on the far side of it. These are not rare experiences. They are among the most common and most privately endured experiences of adult life. What Renee gave the millions of people who watched that afternoon was not a template. Her situation was too specific for templates. What she gave them was a demonstration, a clear, public demonstration that it is possible to be devastated by what someone did to you and not be defined by it. That dignity is not a passive quality but an active one, a choice made continuously, under conditions specifically designed to make it difficult. That the phrase she answered with at the end of her fast money round, "a woman," was not a boast but a statement of fact, offered plainly by a person who had earned the right to say it, and chose to say it simply. Her house in Baton Rouge, the new one, the one she chose herself, has a reading room at the back that her mother helped her furnish. There is a chair she bought at an estate sale, a lamp she had repaired rather than replaced, bookshelves built by Marcus over a long weekend the summer after the divorce. On the mantelpiece above a small fireplace she has never used is a single framed photograph. It is not from the Family Feud stage. It is a photograph of Renee at 19, standing in her nursing whites on the first day of her clinical placement, holding a clipboard, looking directly at the camera with an expression of complete and unhesitating readiness. She put it there on the day she moved in. Simone asked her why that photograph specifically. Renee thought about it for a moment and then said, "Because that woman never needed any of this to know who she was. I wanted to remember that. The person I started as was the right person. I just had to find my way back to her. Nobody else's choices define you. Only yours do." Renee Fontaine found her way back. She is still there, and everything that was done to her, every lie, every ordinary Tuesday spent beside a man living a double life, is part of her story, but it is not the whole of it, and it is not the ending. She decided that. She walked onto a stage in Atlanta and said the true thing out loud, played 5 questions that answered with her whole life, and then went home to build the rest.